Chapter 5 of Memoirs of Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Matt Markgraf. Memoirs of Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds by Charles Mackay, Volume 2, Chapter 5. Popular Follies of Great Cities. La fête d'Ondaine, la fête d'Ondon. Vive la fête d'Ondaine. Béranger. The popular humors of a great city are a never-failing source of amusement to the man whose sympathies are hospitable enough to embrace all his kind, and who, refined though he may be himself, will not sneer at the humble wit or grotesque peculiarities of the boozing mechanic, the squalid beggar, the vicious urchin, and all the motley group of the idle, the reckless, and the imitative that swarm in the alleys and broadways of a metropolis. He who walks through a great city to find subjects for weeping may find plenty at every corner to wring his heart. But let such a man walk on his own course and enjoy his grief alone. We are not of those who would accompany him. The miseries of us poor earth-dwellers gain no alleviation from the sympathy of those who merely hunt them out to be pathetic over them. The weeping philosopher too often impairs his eyesight by his woe, and becomes unable from his tears to see the remedies for the evils which he deplores. Thus it will often be found that the man of no tears is the truest philanthropist, as he is the best physician who wears a cheerful face, even in the worst of cases. So many pens have been employed to point out the miseries, and so many to condemn the crimes and vices, and more serious follies of the multitude, that ours shall not increase the number, at least not in this chapter. Our present task shall be less ungracious, and wandering through the busy haunts of great cities, we shall seek only for amusement, and note as we pass a few of the harmless follies and whimsies of the poor. And, first of all, walk where we will, we cannot help hearing from every side a phrase repeated with delight, and received with laughter by men with hard hands and dirty faces, by saucy butcher lads and errand boys, by loose women, by hackney coachmen, cabriolet drivers, and idle fellows who loiter at the corner of streets. Not one utters this phrase without producing a laugh from all within hearing. It seems applicable to every circumstance, and is the universal answer to every question. In short, it is the favorite slang phrase of the day. A phrase that, while its brief season of popularity lasts, throws a dash of fun and frolicsomeness over the existence of squalid poverty and ill-requited labor, and gives them reason to laugh as well as their more fortunate fellows in a higher stage of society. London is peculiarly fertile in this sort of phrases, which spring up suddenly, no one knows exactly in what spot, and pervade the whole population in a few hours, no one knows how. Many years ago, the favorite phrase, for though but a monosyllable, it was a phrase in itself, was quaz. This odd word took the fancy of the multitude in an extraordinary degree, and very soon acquired an almost boundless meaning. When vulgar wit wished to mark its incredulity and raise a laugh at the same time, there was no resource so sure as this popular piece of slang. When a man who asked a favor which he did not choose to grant, he marked his sense of the suitor's unparalleled presumption by exclaiming, quaz. When a mischievous urchin wished to annoy a passenger and create mirth for his comrades, he looked him in the face and cried out, quaz. And the exclamation never failed in its object. When a disputant was desirous of throwing a doubt upon the veracity of his opponent, and getting summarily rid of an argument which he could not overturn, he uttered the word quaz, with a contemptuous curl of his lip, and an impatient shrug of his shoulders. The universal monosyllable conveyed all his meaning, and not only told his opponent that he lied, but that he erred egregiously if he thought that anyone was such a nincompoop as to believe him. Every ale-house resounded with quaz, every street corner was noisy with it, and every wall for miles around was chalked with it. But like all other earthly things, Quaz had its season and passed away as suddenly as it arose, never again to be the pet and the idol of the populace. A new claimant drove it from its place and held undisputed sway till, in its turn, it was hurled from its preeminence and a successor appointed in its stead. "What a shocking bad hat!" was the phrase that was next in vogue. No sooner had it become universal than thousands of idle but sharp eyes were on the watch for any passenger whose hat showed any signs, however slight, of ancient service. Immediately the cry arose, and like the war whoop of the Indians, was repeated by 100 discordant throats. He was a wise man who, finding himself under these circumstances, the observed of all observers, bore his honors meekly. He who showed symptoms of ill feeling at the imputations cast upon his hat only brought upon himself redoubled notice. The mob soon perceive whether a man is irritable, and if of their own class, they love to make sport of him. When such a man, and with such a hat, passed in those days through a crowded neighborhood, he might think himself fortunate if his annoyances were confined to the shouts and cries of the populace. The obnoxious hat was often snatched from his head and thrown into the gutter by some practical joker, and then raised, covered with mud, upon the end of a stick, for the admiration of the spectators, who held their sides with laughter and exclaimed, in the pauses of their mirth, "Oh, what a shocking bad hat! What a shocking bad hat!" Many a nervous poor man, whose purse could but ill spare the outlay, doubtless purchased a new hat before the time in order to avoid exposure in this manner. The origin of this singular saying, which made fun for the metropolis for months, is not involved in the same obscurity as that which shrouds the origin of Quaz and some others. There had been a hotly contested election for the borough of Southwark, and one of the candidates was an eminent hatter. This gentleman, in canvassing the electors, adopted a somewhat professional mode of conciliating their goodwill, and of bribing them without letting them perceive that they were bribed. Whenever he called upon or met a voter whose hat was not of the best material, or, being so, had seen its best days, he invariably said, "What a shocking bad hat you have got! Call at my warehouse, and you shall have a new one." Upon the day of election, this circumstance was remembered, and his opponents made the most of it, by inciting the crowd to keep up an incessant cry of "What a shocking bad hat!" at the time the honorable candidate was addressing them. From Southwark, the phrase spread all over London, and reigned for a time in the supreme slang of the season. Hooky Woka, derived from the chorus of a popular ballad, was also high in favor at one time, and served, like its predecessor, Quaz, to answer all questions. In the course of time, the latter word alone became the favorite, and was uttered with a peculiar drawl upon the first syllable and a sharp turn upon the last. If a lively servant girl was importuned for a kiss by a fellow she did not care about, she cocked her little nose and cried, "Woka!" If a dustman asked his friend for a loan of a shilling, and his friend was either unable or unwilling to accommodate him, the probable answer he would receive was, "Woka!" If a drunken man was reeling about the streets and a boy pulled his coat-tails, or a man knocked his hat over his eyes to make fun of him, the joke was always accompanied by the same exclamation. This lasted for 2 or 3 months, and Woka walked off the stage, never more to be revived for the entertainment of that or any future generation. The next phrase was a most preposterous one. Who invented it, how it arose, or where it was first heard are alike unknown. Nothing about it is certain but that for months it was the slang par excellence of the Londoners, and afforded them a vast gratification. "There he goes with his eye out," or "There she goes with her eye out," as the sex of the party alluded to might be, was in the mouth of everybody who knew the town. The sober part of the community were as much puzzled by this unaccountable saying as the vulgar were delighted with it. The wise thought it very foolish, but the many thought it very funny, and the idle amused themselves by chalking it upon walls or scribbling it upon monuments. But all's that bright must fade, even in slang. The people grew tired of their hobby, and "there he goes with his eye out" was heard no more in its accustomed haunts. Another very odd phrase came into repute in a brief space afterwards, in the form of the impertinent and not universally apposite query, "Has your mother sold her mangle?" But its popularity was not of that boisterous and cordial kind which ensures a long continuance of favor. What tended to impede its progress was that it could not be well applied to the older portions of society. It consequently ran but a brief career and then sank into oblivion. Its successor enjoyed a more extended fame and laid its foundations so deep that years and changing fashions have not sufficed to eradicate it. This phrase was "flare up," and it is even now a colloquialism in common use. It took its rise in the name of the Reform riots when Bristol was nearly half burned by the infuriated populace. The flames were said to have flared up in the devoted city. Whether there was anything peculiarly captivating in the sound or in the idea of these words is hard to say. But whatever was the reason, it tickled the mob fancy mightily, and drove all other slang out of the field before it. Nothing was to be heard all over London but "flare up." It answered all questions, settled all disputes, and was applied to all persons, all things, and all circumstances, and became suddenly the most comprehensive phrase in the English language. The man who had overstepped the bounds of decorum in his speech was said to have flared up. He who had paid visits too repeated to the gin shop and got damaged in consequence had flared up. To put oneself into a passion, to stroll out on a nocturnal frolic and alarm a neighborhood, or to create a disturbance in any shape, was to flare up. A lover's quarrel was a flare-up. So was a boxing match between two blackguards in the street. And the preachers of sedition and revolution recommended the English nation to flare up like the French. So great a favorite was the word that the people loved to repeat it for its very sound. They delighted apparently in hearing their own organs articulate it, and laboring men, when none who could respond to the call were within hearing, would often startle the aristocratic echoes of the West by the well-known slang phrase of the East. Even in the dead hours of the night, the ears of those who watched late or who could not sleep were saluted with the same sound. The drunkard reeling home showed that he was still a man and a citizen by calling "flare up" in the pauses of his hiccup. Drink had deprived him of the power of arranging all other ideas. His intellect was sunk to the level of the brutes, but he clung to humanity by one last link of the popular cry. When he could vociferate that sound, he had rights as an Englishman, and would not sleep in a gutter like a dog. Onwards he went, disturbing quiet streets and comfortable people by his whoop, till exhausted nature could support him no more, and he rolled powerless into the road. When in due time afterwards the policeman stumbled upon him as he lay, that guardian of the peace turned the full light of his lantern on his face and exclaimed, "Here's a poor devil who has been flaring up." Then came the stretcher on which the victim of deep potations was carried to the watch-house, and pitched into a dirty cell among a score of wretches about as far gone as himself, who saluted their new comrade by a loud, long shout of "flare up." So universal was this phrase, and so enduring seemed its popularity, that a speculator, who knew not of the evanescence of slang, established a weekly newspaper under its name. But he was like the man who built his house upon the sand. His foundation gave way under him, and the phrase and the newspaper were washed into the mighty sea of the things that were. The people grew at last weary of the monotony, and "flare up" became vulgar even among them. Gradually, it was left to little boys who did not know the world, and in process of time sank altogether into neglect. It is now heard no more as a piece of popular slang, but the words are still used to signify any sudden outburst either of fire, disturbance, or ill nature. The next phrase that enjoyed the favor of the million was less concise, and seemed to have been originally aimed against precocious youths who gave themselves the airs of manhood before their time. "Does your mother know you're out?" was the provoking query addressed to young men of more than reasonable swagger who smoked cigars in the streets and wore false whiskers to look irresistible. We have seen many a conceited fellow who could not suffer a woman to pass him without staring her out of countenance, reduced at once to his natural insignificance by the mere utterance of this phrase. Apprentice lads and shopmen in their Sunday clothes held the words in abhorrence, and looked fierce when they were applied to them. Altogether, the phrase had a very salutary effect, and in 1,000 instances showed young vanity that it was not half so pretty and engaging as it thought itself. What rendered it so provoking was the doubt it implied as to the capability of self-guidance possessed by the individual to whom it was addressed. "Does your mother know you're out?" was a query of mock concern and solicitude, implying regret and concern that one so young and inexperienced in the ways of a great city should be allowed to wander abroad without the guidance of a parent. Hence the great wrath of those who verged on manhood but had not reached it whenever they were made the subject of it. Even older heads did not like it, and the heir of a ducal house, an inheritor of a warrior's name, to whom they were applied by a cabriolet driver who was ignorant of his rank, was so indignant at the affront that he summoned the offender before the magisterial bench. The fellow had wished to impose upon his lordship by asking double the fare he was entitled to, and when his lordship resisted the demand, he was insultingly asked if his mother knew he was out. All the drivers on the stand joined in the query, and his lordship was fain to escape their laughter by walking away with as much haste as his dignity would allow. The man pleaded ignorance that his customer was a lord, but offended justice fined him for his mistake. When this phrase had numbered its appointed days, it died away like its predecessors, and "Who are you?" reigned in its stead. This new favorite, like a mushroom, seems to have sprung up in a night, or like a frog in Cheapside, to have come down in a sudden shower. One day it was unheard, unknown, uninvented. The next it pervaded London. Every alley resounded with it. Every highway was musical with it, and street to street and lane to lane flung back the one unvarying cry. The phrase was uttered quickly, and with a sharp sound upon the first and last words, leaving the middle little one more than an aspiration. Like all its compeers which had been extensively popular, it was applicable to almost every variety of circumstance. The lovers of a plain answer to a plain question did not like it at all. Insolence made use of it to give offense, ignorance to avoid exposing itself, and waggery to create laughter. Every newcomer into an alehouse taproom was asked unceremoniously, "Who are you?" And if he looked foolish, scratched his head, and did not know what to reply, shouts of boisterous merriment resounded on every side. An authoritative disputant was not unfrequently put down, and presumption of every kind checked by the same query. When its popularity was at its height, a gentleman, feeling the hand of a thief in his pocket, turned suddenly round and caught him in the act, exclaiming, "Who are you?" The mob which gathered round applauded to the very echo, and thought it the most capital joke they had ever heard, the very acme of wit, the very essence of humor. Another circumstance of a similar kind gave an additional fillip to the phrase, and infused new life and vigor into it just as it was dying away. The scene occurred in the chief criminal court of the kingdom. A prisoner stood at the bar. The offense with which he had been charged was clearly proved against him. His counsel had been heard not in his defense, but in extenuation, insisting upon his previous good life and character as reasons for the lenity of the court. "And where are your witnesses?" inquired the learned judge who presided. "Please you, my lord, I knows the prisoner at the bar, and a more honester feller never breathed," said a rough voice in the gallery. The officers of the court looked aghast, and the strangers tittered with ill-suppressed laughter. "Who are you?" said the judge, looking suddenly up, but with imperturbable gravity. The court was convulsed. The titter broke out into a laugh, and it was several minutes before silence and decorum could be restored. When the ushers recovered their self-possession, they made a diligent search for the profane transgressor, but he was not to be found. Nobody knew him, nobody had seen him. After a while, business of the court again proceeded. The next prisoner brought up for trial augured favorably of his prospects when he learned that the solemn lips of the representative of justice had uttered the popular phrase as if he felt and appreciated it. There was no fear that such a judge would use undue severity. His heart was with the people. He understood their language and their manners, and would make allowances for the temptations which drove them into crime. So thought many of the prisoners, if we may infer it from the fact that the learned judge suddenly acquired an immense increase of popularity. The praise of his wit was in every mouth, and "Who are you?" renewed its lease, and remained in possession of public favor for another term in consequence. But it must not be supposed that there were no interregna between the domain of the slang phrase and another. They did not arise in one long line of unbroken succession, but shared with song the possession of popular favor. Thus, when the people were in the mood for music, slang advanced its claims to no purpose. And when they were inclined for slang, the sweet voice of music wooed them in vain. About 30 years ago, London resounded with one chorus, with the love of which everybody seemed to be smitten. Girls and boys, young men and old, maidens and wives and widows were all alike musical. There was an absolute mania for singing. And the worst of it was that, like good Father Philip in the romance of The Monastery, they seemed utterly unable to change their tune. "Cherry ripe, was the universal cry of all the idle in the town. Every unmelodious voice gave utterance to it. Every crazy fiddle, every cracked flute, every wheezy pipe, every street organ was heard in the same strain, until studious and quiet men stopped their ears in desperation, or fled miles away into the fields or woodlands to be at peace. This plague lasted for a 12-month, until the very name of cherries became an abomination in the land. At last the excitement wore itself away, and the tide of favor set in a new direction. Whether it was another song or a slang phrase is difficult to determine at this distance of time, but certain it is that very shortly afterwards people went mad upon a dramatic subject, and nothing was to be heard of but Tommy and Jerry. Verbal wit had amused the multitude long enough, and they became more practical in their recreation. Every youth on the town was seized with the fierce desire of distinguishing himself by knocking down the Charlies, being locked up all night in a watch-house, or kicking up a row among loose women and blackguard men in the low dens of St. Giles's. Imitative boys vied with their elders in similar exploits until this unworthy passion, for such it was, had lasted. Like other follies, its appointed time, and the town became merry after another fashion. It was the next thought the height of vulgar wit to answer all questions by placing the point of the thumb upon the tip of the nose and twirling the fingers in the air. If one man had wished to insult or annoy another, he had only to make use of this cabalistic sign in his face, and his object was accomplished. At every street corner where a group was assembled, the spectator who was curious enough to observe their movements would be sure to see the fingers of some of them at their noses, either as a mark of incredulity, surprise, refusal, or mockery, before he had watched 2 minutes. There is some remnant of this absurd custom to be seen to this day, but it is thought low even among the vulgar. About 16 years ago, London became again most preposterously musical. The vox populi wore itself hoarse by singing the phrases of "the sea, the sea." If a stranger and a philosopher had walked through London and listened to the universal chorus, he might have constructed a very pretty theory upon the love of the English for the sea service, and our acknowledged superiority over all other nations upon that element. No wonder, he might have said, that this people is invincible upon the ocean. The love of it mixes with their daily thoughts. They celebrate it even in the marketplace. Their street minstrels excite charity by it, and high and low, young and old, male and female, chant low paeans in its praise. Love is not honored in the national songs of this warlike race. Bacchus is no god to them. They are men of sterner mold. and think only of the sea, and the means of conquering upon it. Such would doubtless have been his impression if he had taken the evidence only of his ears. Alas, in those days, for the refined ears that were musical, great was their torture when discord, with its 1,000 diversities of tone, struck up this appalling anthem. There was no escape from it. The migratory minstrels of Savoy caught the strain and pealed it down the long vistas of quiet streets, till their innermost and snuggest apartments re-echoed with the sound. Men were obliged to endure this crying evil for full 6 months, wearied to desperation and made seasick on the dry land. Several other songs sprang up in due succession afterwards, but none of them, with the exception of one entitled All Round My Hat, enjoyed any extraordinary share of favor, until an American actor introduced a vile song called Jim Crow. The singer sang his verses in appropriate costume, with grotesque gesticulations, and a sudden whirl of his body at the close of each verse. It took the taste of the town immediately. And for months the ears of orderly people were stunned by the senseless chorus. Turn about and wheel about and do just so. Turn about and wheel about and jump, Jim Crow. Street minstrels blackened their faces in order to give proper effect to the verses, and featherless urchins who had to choose between thieving and singing for their livelihood took up the latter course, as likely to be the more profitable as long as the public taste remained in that direction. The uncouth dance, its accompaniment, might be seen in its full perfection on market nights in any great thoroughfare, and the words of the song might be heard piercing above all the din and buzz of the ever-moving multitude. He, the calm observer, who, during the heyday popularity of this doggerel, sate beside the public way, thick strewn with summer dust, and saw the stream of people there was hurrying to and fro, numerous as gnats upon the evening gleam, might have exclaimed with Shelley that the million with fierce song and maniac dance did rage around. The philosophic theorist we have already supposed soliloquizing upon the English character and forming his opinion of it from their exceeding love for a sea-song might, if he had again dropped suddenly into London, have formed another very plausible theory to account for our unremitting efforts for the abolition of the slave trade. Benevolent people, he might have said, how unbounded are your sympathies, your unhappy brethren of Africa, differing from you only in the color of their skins, are so dear to you, and you begrudge so little the 20 million you have paid on their behalf, that you love to have a memento of them continually in your sight. Jim Crow is the representative of that injured race, and such is the idol of your populace. See how they all sing his praises, how they imitate his peculiarities, how they repeat his name in their moments of leisure and relaxation. They even carve images of him to adorn their hearths, and his cause and his sufferings may never be forgotten. O philanthropic England! O vanguard of civilization! Such are a few of the peculiarities of the London multitude, when no riot, no execution, no murder, no balloon disturbs the even current of their thoughts. These are the whimsies of the mass, the harmless follies by which they unconsciously endeavor to lighten the load of care which presses upon their existence. The wise man, even though he smile at them, will not altogether withhold his sympathy, and will say, let them enjoy their slang phrases and their choruses if they will, and if they cannot be happy, at least let them be merry. To the Englishman, as well as to the Frenchman of whom Béranger sings, there may be some comfort in so small a thing as a song, and we may own with him that «Un peuple attristé, c'est qui rendra la gaieté, c'est la gaudriole, au gai, c'est la gaudriole». End of Chapter 5. Recording by Matt Markgraf.
Chapter 6 of Memoirs of Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sandra Robinson. Memoirs of Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds by Charles Mackay. Volume 2, Chapter 6. Popular Admiration of Great Thieves. Jack. Where shall we find another set of practical philosophers who, to a man, are above the fear of death? Wat. Sound men and true. Robin. Of tried courage and indefatigable industry. Ned. Who is there here that would not die for his friend? Harry. Who is there here that would betray him for his interest? Matt. Show me a gang of courtiers that could say as much. Dialogue of Thieves in the Beggar's Opera. Whether it be that the multitude, feeling the pangs of poverty, sympathize with the daring and ingenuous depredators who take away the rich man's superfluity, or whether it be the interest that mankind in general feel for the records of perilous adventure, it is certain that the populace of all countries look with admiration upon great and successful thieves. Perhaps both these causes combine to invest their career with charms in the popular eye. Almost every country in Europe has its traditional thief, whose exploits are recorded with all the graces of poetry, and whose trespasses, quote, are cited up in rhymes, and sung by children in succeeding tunes, end quote. Those travellers who have made national manners and characteristics their peculiar study have often observed and remarked upon this feeling. The learned Abbé Leblanc, who resided for some time in England at the commencement of the 18th century, says in his amusing letters on the English and French nations, that he continually met with Englishmen who were not less vain in boasting of the success of their highwaymen than of the bravery of their troops. Tales of their address, their cunning, or their generosity were in the mouths of every body, and a noted thief was a kind of hero in high repute. He adds that the mob in all countries, being easily moved, look in general with concern upon criminals going to the gallows. But an English mob looked upon such scenes with extraordinary interest. They delighted to see them go through their last trials with resolution, and applauded those who were insensible enough to die as they had lived, braving the justice both of God and men. Such, he might have added, as the noted robber Macpherson, of whom the old ballad says, quote, "Sae rantingly, sae wantingly, sae dauntingly good he. He played a spring and danced it round beneath the gallows tree." End quote. Among these traditional thieves, the most noted in England, or perhaps in any country, is Robin Hood, a name which popular affection has encircled with a peculiar halo. Quote, "He robbed the rich to give to the poor," end quote, "and his reward has been an immortality of fame, a tithe of which would be thought more than sufficient to recompense a benefactor of his species." Romance and poetry have been emulous to make him all their own, and the forest of Sherwood in which he roamed with his merry men, armed with their longbows and clad in Lincoln green, has become the resort of pilgrims, and a classic spot sacred to his memory. The few virtues he had, which would have ensured him no praise if he had been an honest man, have been blazoned forth by popular renown during 7 successive centuries, and will never be forgotten while the English tongue endures. His charity to the poor, and his gallantry and respect for women, have made him the preeminent thief of all the world. Among English thieves of a later date, who has not heard of Claude Duval, Dick Turpin, Jonathan Wild, and Jack Sheppard, those knights of the road and of the town, whose peculiar chivalry formed at once the dread and the delight of England during the 18th century? Turpin's fame is unknown to no portion of the male population of England after they have attained the age of 10. His wondrous ride from London to York has endeared him to the imagination of millions. His cruelty in placing an old woman upon a fire to force her to tell him where she had hidden her money is regarded as a good joke, and his proud bearing upon the scaffold is looked upon as a virtuous action. The Abbé Leblanc, writing in 1737, says he was continually entertained with stories of Turpin, how when he robbed gentlemen he would generously leave them enough to continue their journey, and exact a pledge from them never to inform against him, and how scrupulous such gentlemen were in keeping their word. He was one day told a story with which the relator was in the highest degree delighted. Turpin, or some other noted robber, stopped a man whom he knew to be very rich, with the usual salutation, quote, "Your money or your life," end quote. But not finding more than 5 or 6 guineas about him, he took the liberty of entreating him, in the most affable manner, never to come out so ill provided, adding that, if he fell in with him, and he had no more than such a paltry sum, he would give him a good licking. Another story, told by one of Turpin's admirers, was of a robbery he had committed upon a Mr. C. near Cambridge. He took from this gentleman his watch, his snuff-box, and all his money but 2 shillings, and, before he left him, required his word of honour that he would not cause him to be pursued or brought before a justice. The promise being given, they both parted very courteously. They afterwards met at Newmarket, and renewed their acquaintance. Mr. C. kept his word religiously. He had not only refrained from giving Turpin into custody, but made a boast that he had fairly won some of his money back again in an honest way. Turpin offered to bet with him on some favourite horse, and Mr. C. accepted the wager with as good a grace as he could have done from the best gentleman in England. Turpin lost his bet and paid it immediately, and was so smitten with the generous behaviour of Mr. C. that he told him how deeply he regretted that the trifling affair which had happened between them did not permit them to drink together. The narrator of this anecdote was quite proud that England was the birthplace of such a highwayman. Footnote. The Abbé, in the second volume, in the letter No. 79, addressed to Monsieur de Buffon, gives the following curious particulars of the robbers of 1737, which are not without interest at this day, if it were only to show the vast improvement which has taken place since that period. Quote, "It is usual in travelling to put 10 or a dozen guineas in a separate pocket, as a tribute to the first that comes to demand them the right of passport, which custom has established here in favour of the robbers, who are almost the only highway surveyors in England, has made this necessary, and accordingly the English call these fellows the gentlemen of the road, the government letting them exercise their jurisdiction upon travellers without giving them any great molestation. To say the truth, they content themselves with only taking the money of those who obey without disputing. But notwithstanding their boasted humanity, the lives of those who endeavour to get away are not always safe. They are very strict and severe in levying their impost, and if a man has not wherewithal to pay them, he may run the chance of getting himself knocked on the head for his poverty. About 15 years ago, these robbers, with the view of maintaining their rights, fixed up papers at the doors of rich people about London, expressly forbidding all persons of whatsoever quality or condition from going out of town without 10 guineas and a watch about them, on pain of death. In bad times, when there is little or nothing to be got on the roads, these fellows assemble in gangs to raise contributions even in London itself, and the watchmen seldom trouble themselves to interfere with them in their vocation." End quote. End footnote. End bracket. Not less familiar to the people of England is the career of Jack Sheppard, as brutal a ruffian as ever disgraced his country, but who has claims upon the popular admiration which are very generally acknowledged. He did not, like Robin Hood, plunder the rich to relieve the poor, nor rob with an uncouth sort of courtesy like Turpin, but he escaped from Newgate with the fetters on his limbs. This achievement, more than once repeated, has encircled his felon brow with the wreath of immortality, and made him quite a pattern thief among the populace. He was no more than 23 years of age at the time of his execution, and he died much pitied by the crowd. His adventures were the sole topics of conversation for months. The print shops were filled with his effigies, and a fine painting of him was made by Sir Richard Thornhill. The following complimentary verses to the artist appeared in the British Journal of November 28, 1724. Quote, "Thornhill, 'tis thine to gild with fame the obscure, and raise the humble name, to make the form elude the grave, and Shepherd from oblivion save. Appels Alexander drew, Caesar is to Aurelius due, Cromwell in Lilly's works doth shine, and Shepherd, Thornhill, lives in thine." End quote. This was a very equivocal sort of compliment, and might have meant that if Appels were worthy to paint a monarch, Thornhill was worthy to paint a thief. But the artist did not view it in that light, nor did the public, for they considered the verses to be very neat, pointed, and flattering. So high was Jack's fame that he was thought a very fit subject for the stage, and a pantomime entertainment called Harlequin Jack Sheppard was devised by one Thurmond, and brought out with considerable success at Drury Lane Theatre. All the scenes were painted from nature, including the public house that the robber frequented in Clare Market, and the condemned cell from which he had made his escape in Newgate. Footnote. Since the publication of the first edition of this volume, Jack Sheppard's adventures have been revived. A novel upon the real or fabulous history of the burglar has afforded, by its extraordinary popularity, a further exemplification of the allegations in the text. The 6th report of the Inspector of Prisons for the Northern Districts of England contains a mass of information upon the pernicious effect of such romances and of the dramas founded upon them. The inspector examined several boys attending the prison school in the New Bailey at Manchester, from whose evidence the following passages bearing upon the subject are extracted. Quote, J.L., aged 14. "The first time I was ever at the theatre was to see Jack Sheppard. There were 2 or 3 boys near the house who were going, and they asked me. I took 6pence from the money I used to lay up weekly for clothes. The next time I went, which was the week after, I borrowed the money from a boy. I returned it to him the Saturday after. I then went many times. I took the money from my mother out of her pocket as she was sitting down and I beside her. There was more than sixpence in her pocket. I got a great love for the theatre and stole from people often to get there. I thought this Jack Sheppard was a clever fellow for making his escape and robbing his master. If I could get out of jail, I think I should be as clever as him. But after all his exploits, he got done at last. I have had the book out of a library at Dole Field. I had paid 2 pence for a book for 3 volumes. I also got Richard Turpin in 2 volumes and paid the same. I have seen Oliver Twist, and think the Artful Dodger is very like some of the boys here. I am here for picking a pocket of £25. H.C., aged 15. When we came to Manchester, I went to the play and saw Jack Sheppard the first night it came out. There were pictures of him about the streets on boards and on the walls. One of them was his picking a pocket in the church. I liked Jack Sheppard much. I had not been in prison there. I was employed in a warehouse at 6 shillings 6 a week, and was allowed 6 out of it for myself, and with that I went regularly to the play. I saw Jack Sheppard afterwards 4 times in 1 week. I got the money out of my money bag by stealth, and without my master's knowledge. I once borrowed 10 shillings in my mother's name from Mrs. Blank, a shopkeeper with whom she used to deal. I went to the play with it. J.M.D., aged 15. I had heard of Jack Sheppard. A lad whom I know told me of it, who had seen it, and said it was rare fun to see him break out of prison. J.L., aged 11, has been to the play twice and seen Jack Sheppard. Went with his brother the first time and by himself the second. I took the money to go a second time out of mother's house, off the chimney-piece, where she had left a 6 pence. It was the first night Jack Sheppard was played. There was great talk about it, and there were nice pictures about it all over the walls. I thought him a very clever fellow, but Blueskin made the most fun. I first went to the markets and began by selling apples. I also knew a lad, Blank, who has been transported, and went with him 2 or 3 times. The most I ever got was 10 shillings out of a till." End quote. The inspector's report on juvenile delinquency at Liverpool contains much matter of the same kind, but sufficient has been already quoted to show the injurious effects of the deification of great thieves by thoughtless novelists. End footnote. End bracket. The Reverend Mr. Villette, the editor of the Annals of Newgate, published in 1754, relates a curious sermon which he says a friend of his heard delivered by a street preacher about the time of Jack's execution. The orator, after animadverting on the great care men took of their bodies, and the little care they bestowed upon their souls, continued as follows, by way of exemplifying the position. Quote, "We have a remarkable instance of this in a notorious malefactor, well known by the name of Jack Sheppard. What amazing difficulties has he overcome! What astonishing things has he performed! And all for the sake of a stinking, miserable carcass, hardly worth the hanging! How dexterously did he pick the chain of his padlock with a crooked nail! How manfully he burst his fetters asunder, climb up the chimney, wrench out the iron bar, break his way through a stone wall, make the strong door of a dark entry fly before him, till he got upon the leads of the prison. Then, fixing a blanket to the wall with a spike, he stole out of the chapel. How intrepidly did he descend to the top of the turner's house, how cautiously pass down the stair, and make his escape to the street door. Oh, that ye were all like Jack Sheppard! Mistake me not, my brethren. I don't mean in a carnal, but in a spiritual sense, for I propose to spiritualize these things. What a shame it would be if we should not think it worth our while to take as much pains and employ as many deep thoughts to save our souls as he has done to preserve his body. Let me exhort ye then to open the locks of your hearts with the nail of repentance. Burst asunder the fetters of your beloved lusts, mount the chimney of hope, take from thence the bar of good resolution. Break through the stone wall of despair and all the strongholds in the dark entry of the valley of the shadow of death. Raise yourselves to the leads of divine meditation. Fix the blanket of faith with the spike of the church. Let yourselves down to the turner's house of resignation, and descend the stairs of humility. So shall you come to the door of deliverance from the prison of iniquity, and escape the clutches of that old executioner, the devil." End quote. Jonathan Wild, whose name has been immortalized by Fielding, was no favorite with the people. He had none of the virtues which, combined with crimes, make up the character of the great thief. He was a pitiful fellow who informed against his comrades, and was afraid of death. This meanness was not to be forgiven by the crowd, and they pelted him with dirt and stones on his way to Tyburn, and expressed their contempt by every possible means. How different was their conduct to Turpin and Jack Sheppard, who died in their neatest attire, with nosegays in their buttonholes, and with the courage that a crowd expects. It was anticipated that the body of Turpin would have been delivered up to the surgeons for dissection, and the people, seeing some men very busily employed in removing it, suddenly set upon them, rescued the body, bore it about the town in triumph, and then buried it in a very deep grave, filled with quicklime to hasten the process of decomposition. They would not suffer the corpse of their hero, of the man who had ridden from London to York in 24 hours, to be mangled by the rude hands of unmannerly surgeons. The death of Claude Duval would appear to have been no less triumphant. Claude was a gentlemanly thief. According to Butler in the famous ode to his memory, he, quote, taught the wild Arabs of the road to rob in a more gentle mode, take prizes more obligingly than those who had never been bred felis, and how to hang in a more graceful fashion than e'er was known before to the dull English nation. End quote. In fact, he was the pink of politeness, and his gallantry to the fair sex was proverbial. When he was caught at last, pent in, quote, stone walls and chains and iron grates, end quote, their grief was in proportion to his rare merits and his great fame. Butler says that to his dungeon, quote, came ladies from all parts, to offer up close prisoners their hearts, which he received as tribute due. Never did bold knight to relieve distressed dames such dreadful feats achieve, as feeble damsels for his sake would have been proud to undertake, and bravely ambitious to redeem the world's loss and their own, strove who should have the honour to lay down and change a life with him. End quote. Among the noted thieves of France, there is none to compare with the famous Amerigo Tête Noire, who flourished in the reign of Charles VI. This fellow was at the head of 400 or 500 men, and possessed 2 very strong castles in Limousin and Auvergne. There was a great deal of the feudal baron about him, although he possessed no revenues but such as the road afforded him. At his death he left a singular will. Quote, I give and bequeath, quote, said the robber, quote, 1,500 francs to St. George's Chapel for such repairs as it may need. To my sweet girl, who so loyally loved me, I give 2,500, and the surplus I give to my companions. I hope they will all live as brothers and divide it amicably among them. If they cannot agree, and the devil of contention gets among them, it is no fault of mine, and I advise them to get a good strong sharp axe and break open my strong box. Let them scramble for what it contains, and the devil seize the hindmost. End quote. The people of Auvergne still recount with admiration the daring feats of this brigand. Of later years, the French thieves have been such unmitigated scoundrels as to have left but little room for popular admiration. The famous Cartouche, whose name has become synonymous with ruffian in their language, had none of the generosity, courtesy, and devoted bravery which are so requisite to make a robber hero. He was born at Paris towards the end of the 17th century, and broken alive on the wheel in November 1727. He was, however, sufficiently popular to have been pitied at his death, and afterwards to have formed the subject of a much-admired drama, which bore his name, and was played with great success in all the theatres of France during the years 1734, 5, and 6. In our own day the French have been more fortunate in a robber. Vidocq bids fair to rival the fame of Turpin and Jack Sheppard. Already he has become the hero of many an apocryphal tale. Already his compatriots boast of his manifold achievements, and express their doubts whether any other country in Europe could produce a thief so clever, so accomplished, so gentlemanly as Vidocq. Germany has its Schinderhannes, Hungary its Schubry, and Italy and Spain a whole host of brigands whose names and exploits are familiar as household words in the mouths of the children and populace of those countries. The Italian banditti are renowned over the world, and many of them are not only very religious, open parentheses, after a fashion, close parentheses, but very charitable. Charity from such a source is so unexpected that the people dote upon them for it. One of them, when he fell into the hands of the police, exclaimed as they led him away, quote, Ho fatto più carità, end quote. Quote, I have given away more in charity than any 3 convents in these provinces, end quote. And the fellow spoke truth. In Lombardy, the people cherish the memory of 2 notorious robbers who flourished about 2 centuries ago under the Spanish government. Their story, according to Macfarlane, is contained in a little book well known to all the children of the province, and read by them with much more gusto than their Bibles. Schinderhannes, the robber of the Rhine, is a great favourite on the banks of the river which he so long kept in awe. Many amusing stories are related by the peasantry of the scurvy tricks he played off upon rich Jews, or too presuming officers of justice, of his princely generosity and undaunted courage. In short, they are proud of him, and would no more consent to have the memory of his achievements disassociated from their river than they would have the rock of Ehrenbreitstein blown to atoms by gunpowder. There is another robber hero of whose character and exploits the people of Germany speak admiringly. Mauschnadel was captain of a considerable band that infested the Rhine, Switzerland, Alsatia, and Lorraine during the years 1824, 5, and 6. Like Jack Sheppard, he endeared himself to the populace by his most hazardous escape from prison. Being confined at Bremen, in a dungeon on the 3rd story of the prison of that town, he contrived to let himself down without exciting the vigilance of the sentinels, and to swim across the Weser, though heavily laden with irons. When about halfway over, he was espied by a sentinel, who fired at him and shot him in the calf of the leg. But the undaunted robber struck out manfully, reached the shore, and was out of sight before the officers of justice could ready their boats to follow him. He was captured again in 1826, tried at Mayence, and sentenced to death. He was a tall, strong, handsome man, and his fate, villain as he was, excited much sympathy all over Germany. The ladies especially were loud in their regret that nothing could be done to save a hero so good-looking and of adventures so romantic from the knife of the headsman. Mr. Charles Macfarlane, in speaking of Italian banditti, remarks that the abuses of the Catholic religion, with its confessions and absolutions, have tended to promote crime of this description. But he adds more truly that priests and monks have not done half the mischief which has been perpetrated by ballad-mongers and storytellers. If he had said playwrights also, the list would have been complete. In fact, the theatre, which can only expect to prosper in a pecuniary sense by pandering to the tastes of the people, continually recurs to the annals of thieves and banditti for its most favourite heroes. These theatrical robbers, with their picturesque attire, wild haunts, jolly, reckless, devil-may-care manners, take a wonderful hold upon the imagination, and whatever their advocates may say to the contrary, exercise a very pernicious influence upon public morals. In the Memoirs of the Duke of Guise upon the Revolution of Naples in 1647 and 1648, it is stated that the manners, dress, and mode of life of the Neapolitan banditti were rendered so captivating upon the stage that the authorities found it absolutely necessary to forbid the representation of dramas in which they figured, and even to prohibit their costume at the masquerades. So numerous were the banditti at this time that the Duke found no difficulty in raising an army of them to aid him in his endeavours to seize on the throne of Naples. He thus describes them, quote, "There were 3,500 men, of whom the oldest came short of 45 years, and the youngest was above 20. They were all tall and well made, with long black hair, for the most part curled, coats of black Spanish leather, with sleeves of velvet or cloth of gold, cloth breeches with gold lace, most of them scarlet, girdles of velvet laced with gold, with 2 pistols on each side, a cutlass hanging at a belt suitably trimmed, 3 fingers broad and 2 feet long, a hawking bag at their girdle, and a powder flask hung about their neck with a great silk riband. Some of them carried firelocks, and others blunderbusses. They had all good shoes with silk stockings, and every one a cap of cloth of gold or cloth of silver, of different colours on his head, which was very delightful to the eye." End quote. The Beggar's Opera in our own country is another instance of the admiration that thieves excite upon the stage. Of the extraordinary success of this piece, when first produced, the following account is given in the notes to the Dunciad, and quoted by Johnson in his Lives of the Poets. Quote, "This piece was received with greater applause than was ever known. Besides being acted in London 63 days without interruption, and renewed the next season with equal applause, it spread into all the great towns of England, was played in many places to the 30th and 40th time, at Bath and Bristol, etc., 50. It made its progress into Wales, Scotland, and Ireland, where it was performed 24 days successively. The ladies carried about with them the favourite songs of it in fans, and houses were furnished with it in screens. The fame of it was not confined to the author only. The person who acted Polly, till then obscure, became all at once the favourite of the town. Her pictures were engraved and sold in great numbers, her life written, books of letters and verses to her published, and pamphlets made even of her sayings and jests. Furthermore, it drove out of England for that season the Italian opera, which had carried all before it for 10 years." End quote. Dr. Johnson, in his Life of the Author, says that Herring, afterwards Archbishop of Canterbury, censured the opera, as giving encouragement not only to vice but to crimes, by making the highwayman the hero, and dismissing him at last unpunished, and adds that it was even said that after the exhibition the gangs of robbers were evidently multiplied. The doctor doubts the assertion, giving as his reason that highwaymen and housebreakers seldom frequent the playhouse, and that it was not possible for anyone to imagine that he might rob with safety because he saw Macheath reprieved upon the stage. But if Johnson had wished to be convinced, he might very easily have discovered that highwaymen and housebreakers did frequent the theatre, and that nothing was more probable than that a laughable representation of successful villainy should induce the young and the already vicious to imitate it. Besides, there is the weighty authority of Sir John Fielding, the chief magistrate of Bow Street, who asserted positively, and proved his assertion by the records of his office, that the number of thieves was greatly increased at the time when the opera was so popular. We have another instance of the same result much nearer our own times. Schiller's Robert, that wonderful play written by a green youth, perverted the taste and imagination of all the young men in Germany. An accomplished critic of our own country (Hazlitt), speaking of this play, says it was the first he ever read, and such was the effect it produced upon him that, "it stunned him like a blow." After the lapse of 25 years he could not forget it. It was still, to use his own words, "an old dweller in the chambers of his brain," and he had not even then recovered enough from it to describe how it was. The high-minded metaphysical thief, its hero, was so warmly admired that several raw students, longing to imitate a character they thought so noble, actually abandoned their homes and their colleges, and betook themselves to the forests and the wilds to levy contributions upon travellers. They thought they would, like More, plunder the rich and deliver eloquent soliloquies to the setting sun or the rising moon, relieve the poor when they met them, and drink flasks of Rhenish with their free companions in rugged mountain passes, or in tents in the thickness of the forests. But a little experience wonderfully cooled their courage. They found that real, everyday robbers were very unlike the conventional banditti of the stage, and that 3 months in prison with bread and water for their fare, and damp straw to lie upon, was very well to read about by their own firesides, but not very agreeable to undergo in their own proper persons. Lord Byron, with his soliloquizing high-souled thieves, has, in a slight degree, perverted the taste of the juvenile rhymers of this country. As yet, however, they have shown more good sense than their fellows of Germany, and have not taken to the woods or the highways. Much as they admire Conrad the Corsair, they will not go to sea and hoist the black flag for him. By words only, and not by deeds, they testify their admiration, and deluge the periodicals and music shops of the land with verses describing pirates and bandits' brides and robber adventures of every kind. But it is the playwright who does most harm, and Byron has fewer sins of this nature to answer for than Gay or Schiller. With the aid of scenery, fine dresses and music, and the very false notions they convey, they vitiate the public taste, not knowing, vulgaire amour, qu'elles forcent les heures pour démolir les murs. In the penny theatres that abound in the poor and populous districts of London, and which are chiefly frequented by striplings of idle and dissolute habits, tales of thieves and murderers are more admired, and draw more crowded audiences than any other species of representation. There the footpad, the burglar, and the highwayman are portrayed in their natural colours, and give pleasant lessons in crime to their delighted listeners. There the deepest tragedy and the broadest farce are represented in the career of the murderer and the thief, and are applauded in proportion to their depth and their breadth. There, whenever a crime of unusual atrocity is committed, it is brought out afresh, with all its disgusting incidents copied from the life, for the amusement of those who will one day become its imitators. With the mere reader, the case is widely different, and most people have a partiality for knowing the adventures of noted rogues. Even in fiction they are delightful. Witness the eventful story of Gil Blas de Santillana, and of that great rascal Don Guzman de Alfarache. Here there is no fear of imitation. Poets, too, without doing mischief, may sing of such heroes when they please, wakening our sympathies for the sad fate of Jemmy Dawson, or Gilderoy, or Macpherson the Dauntless, or celebrating in undying verse the wrongs and the revenge of the great thief of Scotland, Rob Roy. If, by the music of their sweet rhymes, they can convince the world that such heroes are but mistaken philosophers, born a few ages too late, and having both a theoretical and practical love for, the good old rule, the simple plan, that they should take who have the power, that they should keep who can. The world may perhaps become wiser, and consent to some better distribution of its good things, by means of which thieves may become reconciled to the age, and the age to them. The probability, however, seems to be that the charmers will charm in vain, charm they ever so wisely. End of Chapter 6. Recording by Sondra Robinson at sondrarobinson.com.
Chapter 7, Part 1. of Memoirs of Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Matt Markgraf. Memoirs of Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds by Charles Mackay, Volume 2, Chapter 7, Duels and Ordeals, Part 1. There was an ancient sage philosopher who swore the world, as he could prove, was mad of fighting. Hudibras. Most writers, in accounting for the origin of dueling, derive it from the warlike habits of those barbarous nations who overran Europe in the early centuries of the Christian era, and who knew no mode so effectual for settling their differences as the point of the sword. In fact, dueling, taken in its primitive and broadest sense, means nothing more than combating, and is the universal resort of all wild animals, including man, to gain or defend their possessions or avenge their insults. Two dogs who tear each other for a bone, or two bantams fighting on a dunghill for the love of some beautiful hen, or two fools on Wimbledon Common shooting at each other to satisfy the laws of offended honor, stand on the same footing in this respect, and are each and all mere duelists. As civilization advanced, the best informed men naturally grew ashamed of such a mode of adjusting disputes, and the promulgation of some sort of laws for obtaining redress for injuries was the consequence. Still, there were many cases in which the allegations of an accuser could not be rebutted by any positive proof on the part of the accused. And in all these, which must have been exceedingly numerous in the early stages of European society, the combat was resorted to. From its decision there was no appeal. God was supposed to nerve the arm of the combatant whose cause was just, and to grant him the victory over his opponent. As Montesquieu well remarks, this belief was not unnatural among a people just emerging from barbarism. Their manners being wholly warlike, the man deficient in courage, the prime virtue of his fellows, was not unreasonably suspected of other vices besides cowardice, which is generally found to be coexistent with treachery. He, therefore, who showed himself most valiant in the encounter, was absolved by public opinion from any crime with which he might be charged. As a necessary consequence, society would have been reduced to its original elements if the men of thought, as distinguished from the men of action, had not devised some means for taming the unruly passions of their fellows. With this view, governments commenced by restricting within the narrowest possible limits the cases in which it was lawful to prove or deny guilt by the single combat. By the law of Gondebaldu, king of the Burgundians, passed in the year 501, the proof by combat was allowed in all legal proceedings in lieu of swearing. In the time of Charlemagne, the Burgundian practice had spread all over the empire of the Franks, and not only the suitors for justice, but the witnesses and even the judges were obliged to defend their cause, their evidence, or their decision at the point of the sword. Louis the Debonair, his successor, endeavored to remedy the growing evil by permitting the duel only in appeals of felony, in civil cases, or issue joined in a writ of right, and in cases of the court of chivalry or attacks upon a man's knighthood. None were exempt from these trials but women, the sick and the maimed, and persons under 15 or above 60 years of age. Ecclesiastics were allowed to produce champions in their stead. This practice, in the course of time, extended to all trials of civil and criminal cases, which had to be decided by battle. The clergy, whose dominion was an intellectual one, never approved of a system of jurisprudence which tended so much to bring all things under the rule of the strongest arm. From the first day they set their faces against dueling, and endeavored, as far as the prejudices of their age would allow them, to curb the warlike spirit so alien from the principles of religion. In the Council of Valencia, and afterwards in the Council of Trent, they excommunicated all persons engaged in dueling, and not only them, but even the assistants and spectators, declaring the custom to be hellish and detestable, and introduced by the devil for the destruction both of body and soul. They added also that princes who connived at duels should be deprived of all temporal power, jurisdiction, and dominion over the places where they had permitted them to be fought. It will be seen hereafter that this clause only encouraged the practice which it was intended to prevent. But it was the blasphemous error of these early ages to expect that the Almighty, whenever he was called upon, would work a miracle in favor of a person unjustly accused. The priesthood, in condemning the duel, did not condemn the principle on which it was founded. They still encouraged the popular belief of divine interference in all the disputes or differences that might arise among nations or individuals. It was the very same principle that regulated the ordeals with which all their influence they supported against the duel. By the former, the power of deciding the guilt or innocence was vested wholly in their hands, while by the latter they enjoyed no power or privilege at all. It is not to be wondered at that for this reason, if for no other, they should have endeavored to settle all differences by the peaceful mode. While that prevailed, they were, as they wished to be, the first party in the state. But while the strong arm of individual prowess was allowed to be the judge in all doubtful cases, their power and influence became secondary to those of the nobility. Thus it was not the mere hatred of bloodshed which induced them to launch the thunderbolts of excommunication against the combatants. It was a desire to retain the power which, to do them justice, they were in those times the persons best qualified to wield. The germs of knowledge in civilization lay within the bounds of their order, for they were the representatives of the intellectual, as the nobility were of the physical power of man. To centralize this power in the church, and make it the judge of the last resort in all appeals, both in civil and criminal cases, they instituted 5 modes of trial, the management of which lay wholly in their hands. These were the oath upon the evangelists, the ordeal of the cross and the fire ordeal for persons in the higher ranks, the water ordeal for the humbler classes, and lastly the corsned, or bread and cheese ordeal for members of their own body. The oath upon these evangelists was taken in the following manner. The accused who was received to this proof, says Paul Hay, Count du Châtelet, in his Memoirs of Bertrand du Guesclin, swore upon a copy of the New Testament and on the relics of the holy martyrs, or in their tombs, that he was innocent of the crimes imputed to him. He was also obliged to find 12 persons of acknowledged probity who should take oath at the same time that they believed him innocent. This mode of trial led to very great abuses, especially in cases of disputed inheritance, where the hardest swearer was certain of the victory. This abuse was one of the principal causes which led to the preference given to the trial by battle. It is not at all surprising that a feudal baron or captain of the early ages should have preferred the chances of a fair fight with his opponent to a mode by which firm perjury would always be successful. The trial by, or judgment of, the cross, which Charlemagne begged his sons to have recourse to in cases of disputes arising between them, was performed thus. When a person accused of any crime had declared his innocence upon oath, and appealed to the cross for its judgment in his favor, he was brought into the church before the altar. The priests previously prepared 2 sticks exactly like one another, upon one of which was carved a figure of the cross. They were both wrapped up with great care and many ceremonies in a quantity of fine wool, and laid upon the altar or on the relics of the saints. A solemn prayer was then offered up to God that he would be pleased to discover, by the judgment of his holy cross, whether the accused person were innocent or guilty. A priest then approached the altar and took up one of the sticks, and the assistants unswathed it reverently. If it was marked with the cross, the accused person was innocent. If unmarked, he was guilty. It would be unjust to assert that the judgments thus delivered were in all cases erroneous, and it would be absurd to believe that they were left altogether to chance. Many true judgments were doubtless given, and in all probability most conscientiously, for we cannot but believe that the priests endeavored beforehand to convince themselves by secret inquiry and a strict examination of the circumstances whether the appellant were innocent or guilty, and that they took up the crossed or uncrossed stick accordingly. Although, to all other observers, the sticks, as enfolded in the wool, might appear exactly similar, those who enwrapped them could without any difficulty distinguish the one from the other. By the fire ordeal, the power of deciding was just as unequivocally left in their hands. It was generally believed that fire would not burn the innocent, and the clergy, of course, took care that the innocent, or such as it was their pleasure or interest to declare so, should be so warned before undergoing the ordeal as to preserve themselves without any difficulty from the fire. One mode of the ordeal was to place red-hot plowshares on the ground at certain distances, and then, blindfolding the accused person, make him walk barefooted over them. If he stepped regularly in the vacant spaces, avoiding the fire, he was adjudged innocent. If he burned himself, he was declared guilty. As none but the clergy interfered with the arrangement of the plowshares, they could always calculate beforehand the result of the ordeal. To find a person guilty, they had only to place them at irregular distances, and the accused was sure to tread upon one of them. When Emma, wife of King Ethelred and mother of Edward the Confessor, was accused of a guilty familiarity with Alwyn, Bishop of Winchester, she cleared her character in this manner. The reputation not only of their order but of a queen being at stake, a verdict of guilty was not to be apprehended from any plowshares which priests had the heating of. This ordeal was called Judicium Dei, and sometimes the Vulgaris Purgatio, and might also be tried by several other methods. One was to hold in the hand unhurt a piece of red-hot iron, of the weight of 1, 2, or 3 pounds. When we read not only that men with hard hands, but women of softer and more delicate skin could do this with impunity, we must be convinced that the hands were previously rubbed with some preservative, or that the apparently hot iron was merely cold iron painted red. Another mode was to plunge the naked arm into a cauldron of boiling water. The priests then enveloped it in several folds of linen and flannel, and kept the patient confined within the church and under their exclusive care for 3 days. If at the end of that time the arm appeared without a scar, the innocence of the accused person was firmly established. Footnote: very similar to this is the fire ordeal of the modern Hindus, which is thus described in Forbes' Oriental Memoirs. When a man accused of a capital crime chooses to undergo the ordeal trial, he is closely confined for several days. His right hand and arm are covered with thick wax cloth, tied up and sealed in the presence of proper officers to prevent deceit. In the English districts, the covering was always sealed with the company's arms, and the prisoner placed under an European guard. At this time, fixed for the ordeal, a cauldron of oil is placed over a fire. When it boils, a piece of money is dropped into the vessel. The prisoner's arm is unsealed and washed in the presence of his judges and accusers. During this part of the ceremony, the attendant Brahmins supplicate the deity. On receiving their benediction, the accused plunges his hand into the boiling fluid and takes out the coin. The arm is afterwards again sealed up until the time appointed for re-examination. The seal is then broken. If no blemish appears, the prisoner is declared innocent. If the contrary, he suffers the punishment due to his crime. On this trial, the accused thus addresses the element before plunging his hand into the boiling oil. Thou, O fire, pervadest all things, O cause of purity, who givest evidence of virtue and sin, declare the truth in this my hand. If no juggling were practiced, the decisions by this ordeal would be all the same way. But as some are by this means declared guilty and others innocent, it is clear that the Brahmins, like the Christian priests of the Middle Ages, practice some deception in saving those whom they wish to be thought guiltless. End footnote. As regards the water ordeal, the same trouble was not taken. It was a trial only for the poor and humble, and whether they sank or swam was thought of very little consequence. Like the witches of more modern times, the accused were thrown into a pond or river. If they sank and were drowned, their surviving friends had the consolation of knowing that they were innocent. If they swam, they were guilty. In either case, society was rid of them. But of all the ordeals, that which the clergy reserved for themselves was the one least likely to cause any member of their corps to be declared guilty. The most culpable monster in existence came off clear when tried by this method. It was called the corsned, and was thus performed. A piece of barley bread and a piece of cheese were laid upon the altar, and the accused priest, in his full canonicals, and surrounded by all the pompous adjuncts of Roman ceremony, pronounced certain conjurations, and prayed with great fervency for several minutes. The burden of the prayer was that if he were guilty of the crime laid to his charge, God would send his angel Gabriel to stop his throat, that he might not be able to swallow the bread and cheese. There is no instance upon record of a priest having been choked in this manner. Footnote: an ordeal very like this is still practiced in India. Consecrated rice is the article chosen instead of bread and cheese. Instances are not rare in which, through the force of imagination, guilty persons are not able to swallow a single grain. Conscious of their crime and fearful of the punishment of heaven, they feel a suffocating sensation in their throat when they attempt it, and they fall on their knees and confess all that is laid to their charge. The same thing, no doubt, would have applied with the bread and cheese of the Roman Church if it had been applied to any others but ecclesiastics. The latter had too much wisdom to be caught in a trap of their own setting. End footnote. When under Pope Gregory VII, it was debated whether the Gregorian chant should be introduced into Castile instead of the Musarabic given by Saint Isidore of Sevilla to the churches of that kingdom, very much ill feeling was excited. The churches refused to receive the novelty, and it was proposed that the affair should be decided by a battle between two champions, one chosen from each side. The clergy would not consent to a mode of settlement which they considered impious, but had no objection to try the merits of each chant by the fire ordeal. A great fire was accordingly made, and a book of the Gregorian and one of the Musarabic chant were thrown into it, that the flames might decide which was most agreeable to God by refusing to burn it. Cardinal Baronius, who says he was an eyewitness of the miracle, relates that the book of the Gregorian chant was no sooner laid upon the fire than it leaped out uninjured, visibly, and with a great noise. Every one present thought that the saints had decided in favor of Pope Gregory. After a slight interval, the fire was extinguished. But, wonderful to relate, the other book of St. Isidore was found covered with ashes, but not injured in the slightest degree. The flames had not even warmed it. Upon this it was resolved that both were alike agreeable to God, and that they should be used by turns in all the churches of Sevilla. If the ordeals had been confined to questions like this, the laity would have had little or no objection to them. But when they were introduced as decisive in all the disputes that might arise between man and man, the opposition of all those whose prime virtue was personal bravery was necessarily excited. In fact, the nobility, from a very early period, began to look with jealous eyes upon them. They were not slow to perceive their true purport, which was no other than to make the Church the last court of appeal in all cases, both civil and criminal. And not only did the nobility prefer the ancient mode of single combat from this cause, in itself a sufficient one, but they clung to it because an acquittal gained by those displays of courage and address which the battle afforded was more creditable in the eyes of their compeers than one which it required but little or none of either to accomplish. To these causes may be added another, which was perhaps more potent than either in raising the credit of the judicial combat at the expense of the ordeal. The noble institution of chivalry was beginning to take root, and, notwithstanding the clamors of the clergy, war was made the sole business of life, and the only elegant pursuit of the aristocracy. The fine spirit of honor was introduced, any attack upon which was only to be avenged in the lists, within sight of applauding crowds, whose verdict of approbation was far more gratifying than the cold and formal acquittal of the ordeal. Lothaire, son of Louis I, abolished that by fire and the trial of the cross within his dominions. But in England they were allowed so late as the time of Henry III, in the early part of whose reign they were prohibited by an order of council. In the meantime, the Crusades had brought the institution of chivalry to the full height of perfection. The chivalric spirit soon achieved the downfall of the ordeal system, and established the judicial combat on a basis too firm to be shaken. It is true that with the fall of chivalry as an institution fell the tournament and the encounter in the lists, but the duel, their offspring, has survived to this day, defying the efforts of sages and philosophers to eradicate it. Among all the errors bequeathed to us by a barbarous age, it has proved the most pertinacious. It has put variance between men's reason and their honor, put the man of sense on a level with the fool, and made thousands who condemn it submit to it or practice it. Those who are curious to see the manner in which these combatants were regulated may consult the learned Montesquieu, where they will find a copious summary of the code of ancient dueling. Truly does he remark, in speaking of the clearness and excellence of the arrangements, that, as there were many wise matters which were conducted in a very foolish manner, so there were many foolish matters conducted very wisely. No greater exemplification of it could be given than the wise and religious rules of the absurd and blasphemous trial by battle. In the ages that intervened between the Crusades and the new era that was opened out by the invention of gunpowder and printing, a more rational system of legislation took root. The inhabitants of cities engaged in the pursuits of trade and industry were content to acquiesce in the decisions of their judges and magistrates whenever any differences arose among them. Unlike the class above them, their habits and manners did not lead them to seek the battlefield on every slight occasion. A dispute as to the price of a sack of corn, a bale of broadcloth, or a cow could be more satisfactorily adjusted before the mayor or bailiff of their district. Even the martial knights and nobles, quarrelsome as they were, began to see that the trial by battle would lose its dignity and splendor if too frequently resorted to. Governments also shared this opinion, and on several occasions restricted the cases in which it was legal to proceed to this extremity. In France, before the time of Louis IX, duels were permitted only in cases of lèse-majesté, rape, incendiarism, assassination, and burglary. Louis IX, by taking off all restriction, made them legal in civil cases. This was not found to work well, and in 1303, Philip the Fair judged it necessary to confine them in criminal matters to state offenses, rape, and incendiarism, and in civil cases to questions of disputed inheritance. Knighthood was allowed to be the best judge of its own honor, and might defend or avenge it as often as occasion arose. Among the earliest duels upon record is a very singular one that took place in the reign of Louis II, A.D. 878. Ingilgarius, Count of Gatineau, was one morning discovered by his countess dead in bed at her side. Gontran, a relation of the Count, accused the Countess of having murdered her husband, to whom he asserted she had long been unfaithful, and challenged her to produce a champion to do battle in her behalf, that he might establish her guilt by killing him. All the friends and relatives of the Countess believed in her innocence, but Gontran was so stout and bold and renowned a warrior that no one dared to meet him, for which, as Brantôme quaintly says, mauvais apportant peons esté. The unhappy Countess began to despair, when a champion suddenly appeared in the person of Ingelgarius, Count of Anjou, a boy of 16 years of age, who had been held by the Countess on the baptismal font, and received her husband's name. He tenderly loved his godmother, and offered to do battle in her cause against any and every opponent. The king endeavored to persuade the generous boy from his enterprise, urging the great strength, tried skill, and invincible courage of the challenger. But he persisted in his resolution, to the great sorrow of all the court, who said it was a cruel thing to permit so brave and beautiful a child to rush to such butchery and death. When the lists were prepared, the Countess duly acknowledged her champion, and the combatants commenced the onset. Gontran rode so fiercely at his antagonist and hit him on the shield with such impetuosity that he lost his own balance and rolled to the ground. The young count, as Gontran fell, passed his lance through his body, and then, dismounting, cut off his head, which Brantôme says he presented to the king, who received it most graciously, and was very joyful, as much so if anyone had made him a present of a city. The innocence of the Countess was then proclaimed with great rejoicings, and she kissed her godson and wept over his neck with joy in the presence of all the assembly. When the Earl of Essex was accused by Robert de Montfort before King Henry II in 1162 of having traitorously suffered the royal standard of England to fall from his hands in a skirmish with the Welsh at Coelho 5 years previously, the latter offered to prove the truth of the charge by single combat. The Earl of Essex accepted the challenge, and the lists were prepared near Reading. An immense concourse of persons assembled to witness the battle. Essex at first fought stoutly, but losing his temper and self-command, he gave an advantage to his opponent, which soon decided the struggle. He was unhorsed, and so severely wounded that all present thought he was dead. At the solicitation of his relatives, the monk of the Abbey of Reading were allowed to remove the body for interment, and Montfort was declared the victor. Essex, however, was not dead, but stunned only, and under the care of the monks recovered in a few weeks from his bodily injuries. The wounds of his mind were not so easily healed. Though a loyal and brave subject, the whole realm believed him a traitor and a coward because he had been vanquished. He could not brook to return to the world deprived of the good opinion of his fellows. He therefore made himself a monk and passed the remainder of his days within the walls of the abbey. Du Châtelet relates a singular duel that was proposed in Spain. A Christian gentleman of Seville sent a challenge to a Moorish cavalier, offering to prove against him, with whatever weapons he might choose, that the religion of Jesus Christ was holy and divine, and that of Mahomet impious and damnable. The Spanish prelates did not choose that Christianity should be compromised within their jurisdiction by the result of any such combat. The Moorish cavalier might perchance have proved to be the stronger, and they commanded the knight, under pain of excommunication, to withdraw the challenge. The same author relates that under Otho I, a question arose among jurisconsultants, viz., whether children who had lost their father should share equally with their uncles in the property of their grandfather at the death of the latter. The difficulty of this question was found so insurmountable that none of the lawyers of that day could resolve it. It was at last decreed that it should be decided by single combat. 2 champions were accordingly chosen, one for and the other against the claims of the little ones. After a long struggle, the champion of the uncles was unhorsed and slain, and it was therefore decided that the right of the grandchildren was established, and that they should enjoy the same portion of their grandfather's possessions that their father would have done had he been alive. Under pretext just as strange, and often more frivolous than these, duels continued to be fought in most of the countries of Europe during the whole of the 14th and 15th centuries. A memorable instance of the slightness of the pretext on which a man could be forced to fight a duel to the death occurs in the Memoirs of the brave Constable du Guesclin, the advantage he had obtained in a skirmish before Rennes against William Brembre, an English captain, so preyed on the spirits of William Troussel, the chosen friend and companion of the latter, that nothing would satisfy him but a mortal combat with the constable. The Duke of Lancaster, whom Troussel applied for permission to fight the great Frenchman, forbade the battle, as not warranted by the circumstances. Troussel nevertheless burned with a fierce desire to cross his weapon with Du Guesclin, and sought every occasion to pick a quarrel with him. Having so good a will for it, of course he found a way. A relative of his had been taken prisoner by the constable, in whose hands he remained till he was able to pay his ransom. Troussel resolved to make a quarrel out of this, and dispatched a messenger to Du Guesclin, demanding the release of his prisoner and offering a bond at a distant date for the payment of the ransom. Du Guesclin, who had received intimation of the hostile purposes of the Englishman, sent back word that he would not accept his bond, neither would he release his prisoner until the full amount of his ransom was paid. As soon as this answer was received, Troussel sent a challenge to the constable, demanding reparation for the injury he had done in his honor by refusing his bond and offering a mortal combat, to be fought 3 strokes with the lance, 3 with the sword, and 3 with the dagger. Du Guesclin, although ill in bed with the ague, accepted the challenge, and gave notice to the Marshal d'Andreghem, the king's lieutenant general in Lower Normandy, that he might fix the day and the place of combat. The marshal made all necessary arrangements, upon condition that he who was beaten should pay 100 florins of gold to feast the nobles and gentlemen who were witnesses of the encounter. The Duke of Lancaster was very angry with his captain, and told him that it would be a shame to his knighthood and his nation if he forced on a combat with the brave Du Guesclin at a time when he was enfeebled by disease and stretched on the couch of suffering. Upon these representations, Troussel, ashamed of himself, sent notice to Du Guesclin that he was willing to postpone the duel until such time as he should be perfectly recovered. Du Guesclin replied that he could not think of postponing the combat after all the nobility had received notice of it, that he had sufficient strength left not only to meet but to conquer such an opponent as he was, and that if he did not make his appearance in the lists at the time appointed, he would publish him everywhere as a man unworthy to be called a knight, or to wear an honorable sword by his side. Troussel carried this haughty message to the Duke of Lancaster, who immediately gave permission for the battle. On the day appointed, the 2 combatants appeared in the lists, in the presence of several thousand spectators. Du Guesclin was attended by the flower of the French nobility, including the Marshal de Beaumanoir, Olivier de Mauny, Bertrand de Saint-Pin, and the Viscount de la Bellière, while the Englishman appeared with no more than the customary retinue of 2 seconds, 2 squires, 2 couteliers or daggermen, and 2 trumpeters. The first onset was unfavorable to the constable. He received so heavy a blow on his shield arm that he fell forward to the left upon his horse's neck, and being weakened by his fever was nearly thrown to the ground. All his friends thought he could never recover himself, and began to deplore his ill fortune. But Du Guesclin collected his energies for a decisive effort, and at the second charge aimed a blow at the shoulder of his enemy, which felled him to the earth mortally wounded. He then sprang from his horse, sword in hand, with the intention of cutting off the head of his fallen foe, when the Marshal d'Andreghem, threw a golden wand into the arena as a signal that hostilities should cease. Du Guesclin was proclaimed the victor amid the joyous acclamations of the crowd, and retiring, left the field to the meaner combatants, who were afterwards to make sport for the people. 4 English and as many French squires fought for some time with pointless lances, when the French, gaining the advantage, the